Hi all, and welcome to this brief mini lecture on the subject that's an overview of the West's maritime explorations. Now I want to apologize briefly. Most of the mini lectures this week, I'm going to sound a little hoarse. Hopefully I'm still understandable. Again, some of the material that we will be looking at this week should seem quite familiar to you, but I'm hoping that it'll still remain interesting, that we'll give you some details maybe you didn't have before. From Europe, access to the Indian Ocean was actually well worth pursuing. Merchants craved a share of the richest trades and most prosperous markets in the world. They really wanted the spices, the drugs, and the aromatics of Sri Lanka, parts of India, and Indonesia. Those products were the most profitable in the world in terms of price per unit of weight. But this journey was too long, too laborious, and too hazardous to generate much profit due to the nature of the winds sailing from Europe to the Indian Ocean arena, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. The matter was further complicated by the fact that, quite frankly, Europeans had little to offer the Chinese, Indians, and Indonesians that these other folks might want, excepting, of course, shipping services for Asian goods. Now, in order to grasp why it took until the late 15th century for Europeans to enter the Indian Ocean trade, we need to study the wind maps. Europe's only effective access by sea to the Indian Ocean, which is off the map over here, is sailing down the west coast of Africa, around Cape Horn, and up into the Indian Ocean, which is this over here. In the Atlantic, north and south, there are ocean currents indicated here by the blue, and there are wind currents known as prevailing winds marked here in red. And what you see is that any time of year, the prevailing winds in the Atlantic Ocean remain the same direction. The Indian Ocean is different. Over here, the wind system in the Indian Ocean basin is what's called monsoonal. That is to say, the prevailing winds in the monsoonal system blow one direction in the summer and the other direction in the winter. As a result of these differences, it took a long time for Europeans to figure out how to navigate when to time their arrival in the Indian Ocean basin to take advantage of these prevailing winds, or rather these monsoons. Because if the monsoons are blowing against you, you're really not going to go anywhere very fast. Navigators had to develop fixed wind systems that could explore and decode these winds patterns, and without the accurate wind maps necessary, the explorers could not return home. They could sail into the wind, getting blown backward and accomplishing very little, or they could sail with the wind, never to be heard from again. Norse explorers in the 10th and the 11th centuries overcame some of the limitations of navigating on the ocean by sailing west using a combination of currents and a means of tracking their travel along a single latitude using a sun compass. This meant that the sun compass would allow them to travel along a single line, and actually it's longitude rather than latitude, traveling along a single line of longitude for very long distances. By holding this and seeing where the sun's shadow fell on it, they could determine if they were still sailing in a straight line. They followed the currents and the information of their sun compass, crossing the Atlantic below the Arctic to go west, and they checked the direction once or twice daily with their sun compass to confirm that they were still headed in a straight line. Then they used the westerly winds and the sun compass to get home. So they were traveling from here, across this line, over to here. But this tactic led them to relatively poor and underpopulated regions. The technology to exploit the Atlantic's wind systems only gradually became available to the rest of Europe during a long, slow development period in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. Like most technology, it was developed through trial and error, a process that's mostly undocumented from that period. Hull design, rigging, and thus the maneuverability of the ship, all of these needed to be improved. In addition, shipboard water casks had to be made secure for long voyages so that their fresh water, their drinking water, would be kept pure. They also had to improve their knowledge of the winds and the currents beyond coastal regions. And so it was not until until the 13th century that European discovery of the Atlantic was launched from deep in the Mediterranean. These early efforts were hampered by the requirement of needing to stay within sight of the shore. And of course, they were also disrupted by disasters like the Black Death and economic downturns. So it took a long time for Europeans to accumulate the necessary knowledge and experience. Each series of expeditions went a little farther than the last and gained a bit more understanding. And they first extended across small islands in the Atlantic and then down the coast of West Africa. And as they did those travels, as they went across the islands and then down this west coast, they gained additional lands which were frequently turned into sugar plantations or areas to trade or buy slaves, which they would then sell elsewhere. The turning point was in the 1480s when Atlantic exploration really began to pay off. In the 1490s, European efforts to reach out resulted in new land contacts abroad. North America was reached by Christopher Columbus with the backing of the Italians and the Spanish. Vasco da Gama for Portugal struggled around the Cape of Good Hope down here at the southern tip of Africa, and entered into the Indian Ocean trade realm. Thus, the Atlantic Ocean had a wind system that inhibited exploration, but when successfully launched, would reward that exploration spectacularly.